day Yusuf's father was buried, nobody told him. He found out because the neighbors stopped looking at him directly. They would glance at him in the street and then look away, the way people look away from something that hurts them to see. He was 6 years old, and he had been at school when it happened, sitting at a desk that wobbled on uneven legs, copying letters onto a piece of paper that was already used on the other side. His teacher had not said anything to him. His classmates had not said anything. He had walked home in the late afternoon and found his mother sitting on the floor of their kitchen, not crying, just sitting, with her hands in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point on the wall that had nothing on it. He asked her where his father was. She did not answer for a long time. Then she said, "Gone." That was the whole conversation. He did not ask again. Their home was in Marand, a small town pressed between mountains in the northwestern corner of Iran. It was a place where people knew everything about each other, and said almost nothing. The houses were made of mud brick that turned gold in the afternoon sun. The streets were narrow and uneven, and smelled of bread in the mornings and dust in the afternoons. Yusuf had spent his whole short life in those streets, but after that day, the town felt different to him, smaller, harder, like a coat that had shrunk in the wash. His father had been a laborer. He had carried things, lifted things, moved things from one place to another. He had not left a debt, which was a mercy, his mother would say later, with a tone that made it clear she did not think it was much of a mercy. What he had left was a wife, a son, and a room with 2 thin mattresses rolled against the wall, and a stove that sometimes worked and sometimes did not. His mother's name was Fatimeh. She was a small woman with large, quick hands, and within a week of her husband's death, those hands were washing other people's laundry. She would rise before the sun and carry bundles through the streets to the river, where she would kneel in the cold and work until her knuckles were raw. She never complained about this in front of Yusuf. She complained about other things: the price of flour, the neighbor's dog, the broken gutter that sent water down the wrong side of the wall. But never the work she simply did. Yusuf watched her and learned something that would take him years to name. What he learned was that dignity is not something you are given. It is something you perform, every day, in small and unremarkable ways, until it becomes the truth about you. He was not a sentimental child. He did not cry often, and when he did it alone. He had friends in the way that small boys in small towns have friends, which is to say he spent time with other boys and they played together and argued and sometimes fought, but none of it went very deep. What went deep in Yusuf was the thing he did with his mind. He remembered everything, not in the way that people say they remember everything when they mean they have a good memory. He remembered in the way that a stone holds warmth long after the sun has moved. A fact once inside him stayed, a number, a name, a rule of grammar, a date on a page, a formula on a blackboard. All of it lodged somewhere behind his eyes and refused to leave. His teachers noticed this and did not know what to do with it. Some of them were pleased. 1 or 2 were unsettled, the way people are unsettled by something that does not fit neatly into the category they have prepared for it. He was, by the time he was 8, reading books that were not assigned to him. He got them from wherever he could, which was not easy. The town's small library had locked cabinets, and a librarian, who believed that books were for looking at, not touching. But there was a man named Abbas Shirazi on the far side of the market who sold old things, including old books, and who did not much care what a boy did with his time, as long as the boy did not bother him. Yusuf would sit in the corner of Abbas's cluttered shop and read for hours, and Abbas would smoke his pipe and ignore him, and this arrangement suited them both. He read about geography and history and engineering, though he did not yet know the word engineering. He read about bridges, and about the way water moved, and about the way mountains were formed. He read a book about a French engineer who had built a tunnel through the Alps, and felt, for the first time in his life, that he had found a category of human activity that made sense to him. Here was a problem. Here was a solution. Here was a man who had looked at a mountain and decided, calmly and without drama, that the mountain was wrong, and he was going to correct it. Yusuf went home that evening and told his mother he was going to be an engineer. She looked at him over the pot she was stirring, which had very little in it. She did not laugh. She did not tell him to be realistic. She said, "Then you will need to be better than the boys who already have money." He nodded. He already knew this. He had known it for a long time. By the time he was 10, he was helping his mother at night, not with the laundry, which was too heavy for him, but with the accounts. The women who hired his mother sometimes paid late, and sometimes paid less than they had agreed, and sometimes pretended to have forgotten the agreement altogether. Yusuf began keeping records on scraps of paper, writing down names and amounts and dates in his careful, small handwriting. When a woman came to the door and said she had only paid half because the work was not quite right, Yusuf would produce the scrap of paper. He would not argue. He would simply show her the number she had agreed to. in writing, with the date. Most of the women paid after that. A few did not, and Yusuf remembered them, not with anger, but with the quiet, patient attention of someone who knows that accounts have a way of being settled eventually. His mother did not thank him for this. She was not a woman who said thank you easily, to anyone, for anything. But she began leaving the scraps of paper on his side of the room, and once, when he was 11, she put her hand briefly on the top of his head as she passed, and then walked on without saying anything, and that was how Yusuf knew she saw him. The school in Morand had 2 rooms and 3 teachers, and not enough of anything. The desks were old and the chalk was always running out, and the books were shared between 4 students and were missing pages in ways that seemed to have been chosen deliberately to cause the most possible confusion. The teachers were not bad men, but they were tired, and tired men teach only what they absolutely must and nothing else. Yusuf absorbed everything they gave him and then sat quietly hungry for more, which is a specific kind of hunger that has no name in most languages but is immediately recognizable in the face of any child who has ever felt it. He would finish his work and then look out the window, not because he was bored in the ordinary sense, but because the classroom had nothing left to give him, and the world outside still might. It was in that school, in the autumn of 1957, that the thing happened. He had not eaten that morning. This was not unusual. There were mornings when his mother had nothing to give him and said so plainly, and he went to school on an empty stomach and tried not to think about it. But this particular morning the emptiness was worse than usual, the way some cold mornings are colder than other cold mornings even when the temperature is the same. By mid-morning the room had begun to tilt slightly at the edges of his vision. He gripped the edge of his desk and told himself this was temporary, which it was, but that fact was not as comforting as it should have been. He was 12 years old. He was in the middle of copying a geography lesson about the rivers of Khorasan when his grip on the desk loosened. He did not fall. He slumped, which is different and in some ways worse. His teacher, a man named Mr. Hosseini, who wore the same gray jacket every day and smelled faintly of tobacco and disinfectant, came and stood over him and said his name twice with increasing irritation, and then took him by the arm and walked him to the courtyard. It was a small courtyard with a dry fountain in the middle and a pomegranate tree against the far wall that was past the season for pomegranates. Mr. Hosseini sat him on the edge of the fountain and told him to breathe, which was not as helpful a suggestion as Mr. Hosseini seemed to believe. Then the teacher went back inside, because there were other children and other lessons, and one hungry boy in the courtyard was not a crisis that required his sustained attention. Yusuf sat. The stone was cold. The sky above him was the color of old milk. He was aware, in a distant way, of the sounds of the school around him, the scrape of chalk, the occasional raised voice, the footsteps of children moving between rooms. He put his hands flat on the stone and pressed, because the solidity of the stone was something to hold on to. He did not hear her coming. She was simply not there, and then she was. A girl from the class next to his. He knew her by sight, the way you know the faces of the people you pass every day without ever speaking to. A face that belongs to the landscape rather than to your life. She was the baker's daughter, he knew that much, because her father's shop was 2 streets from his house and he had passed it every morning for as long as he could remember. Her name, he would find out later, was Maryam. At that moment she was simply a girl in a blue headscarf carrying her lunchtime bread, walking across the courtyard toward the gate. She stopped when she saw him. She looked at him for a moment, not a long moment, not a dramatic moment, just a moment. The ordinary pause of a person who has seen something that requires a small adjustment to their plan. Then she looked away. She tore a piece from the flatbread in her hand. Not a large piece, not a small piece, just a piece, and she set it on the stone beside his hand. She did not look at him when she did it. She did not say anything. She did not wait to see what he would do. She walked on through the gate and was gone. He looked at the bread for a long time. It was an ordinary piece of bread, the kind that was in every kitchen in the town, thin and slightly scorched at the edges and smelling of the oven. It was not special bread. It was just bread. But the way it had arrived, without announcement, without performance, without any expectation of return, made it the most significant thing that had happened to him in his 12 years of life. He ate it slowly. He did not gulp it down the way a hungry boy might. He sat on the cold stone edge of the dry fountain and ate it slowly, and looked at the bare pomegranate tree and felt something settle in him, some shaken thing coming back to its correct position. He did not speak to Maryam that day. He did not speak to her the next day, or the day after. She returned to her classroom and he returned to his, and the distance between them reasserted itself the way distances do when they have been there long enough. She had done something, and then she had gone, and that was the shape of it, clean and complete. But Yusuf was a boy who remembered everything. He carried the memory the way his mother carried laundry, Not consciously, not always, but always with him. It went where he went. It grew as he grew. It did not become a story he told. It became a kind of standard, a measure against which he would, for the rest of his life, hold up the behavior of every other person he encountered. She had seen him at his lowest point and had not looked away. She had given what she had, without ceremony, and had not waited for gratitude. She had not even stayed long enough to receive it. He had met very few people in his 12 years. He would go on to meet many thousands more. None of them, not one, would ever entirely unseat that girl in the blue headscarf from the position she had occupied in his understanding of what a human being could be. In the afternoons after school, Yusuf would walk the long way home so he could pass the bakery. He was not looking for Miriam. He was not, at 12, in the grip of any particular feeling that had a name. He was simply noting a location, the way a navigator notes a landmark. Something important had happened near that place. The place was therefore important. This was the logic of a mind that organized the world through coordinates. The bakery was a low building with a wooden door that was always open, and a warmth that spilled out into the street even in winter. He could smell the bread from half a block away. Her father was a wide, cheerful man who stood behind the counter and made change with the swiftness of someone who had done it 100,000 times. Yusuf would pass the open door and feel the warmth and walk on. At home, his mother would be returning from the river, her hands red, her shoulders stiff. She would heat the small stove and whatever was in the kitchen would become dinner, and they would eat together mostly in silence. After dinner, Yusuf would study. This was not a decision he made each night. It was simply what the evenings were for. He was working towards something, though the shape of it was not yet clear to him. He knew only that he was going to leave Marand, not because he hated it, not because it had treated him badly. He was going to leave because the answer to the problem of his life was somewhere else, in a city or a university or an office he had not yet seen, and staying was not an option that his particular mind would allow him to choose. His mother knew this. She never said so, but she kept his study lamp filled with oil when everything else went short, and that was enough. The year he turned 13, a new teacher arrived at the school. His name was Mr. Karimi, and he was young, and he had come from Tehran, and he was the first person in Yusuf's life who understood precisely what he was looking at when he looked at Yusuf. He sat the boy down after class one afternoon and said, without preamble, that Yusuf needed to take the national scholarship exam, and that if he did not, it would be a waste that Mr. Karimi personally refused to be responsible for. Yusuf said he did not know about the scholarship exam. Mr. Karimi said that was because no one in Marand had bothered to tell the students who needed to know. He produced a pamphlet. He set it on the desk. He said he would prepare Yusuf in the evenings, after school, at no cost, on condition that Yusuf showed up every time and worked hard. Yusuf said he would. He meant it in the way he meant everything, which was absolutely. They worked together for 8 months. Mr. Karimi was the kind of teacher who treated a student's intelligence as a gift that came with obligations. He did not praise Yusuf often. He corrected him constantly. He pushed him into areas of mathematics and science that were well beyond the school's curriculum, and then stood back and watched Yusuf find his own way through them, which he always did, eventually. The exam was held in Tabriz. Yusuf had never been to Tabriz. It was a city, and cities were a different order of thing than towns, with their wide streets and their noise and their sense of continuous motion that was both exciting and slightly alarming. He traveled by bus on a cold morning in February, with a letter from Mr. Karimi in his pocket, and enough money for one night at a cheap guest house, which his mother had saved for him over 3 months without saying a word about it. He sat the exam in a large hall with 200 other boys. He was, by his own assessment, the most poorly dressed person in the room. He noticed this, and then decided that it was irrelevant information, and filed it accordingly. He read the exam paper, and felt, for the first time in a setting that was not Abbas Shirazi's cluttered shop, something approaching joy. The problems were difficult. They were exactly the right kind of difficult. He worked through them with the concentrated calm of a man disarming something, careful and precise, and entirely unafraid. He came first in the province. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. His mother was out. He read it alone, standing in the middle of the kitchen. He read it again. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases and put it on the table, and went and sat outside on the step and looked at the street for a while. 2 boys were kicking a can somewhere further down. A woman was hanging washing on a line across the alley. A cat sat on a wall and watched everything with the mild contempt that cats reserve for the visible world. He thought about Miriam. He did not know why. The thought simply came, as it sometimes did, without invitation or explanation. He thought about the piece of bread on the stone, and the sound of her footsteps going away. He thought that if she had not done that, had not seen him and chosen, in one unremarked moment, to do the simplest possible human thing, he might have sat on that stone for a very long time. Long enough to miss Mr. Karimi's first session. Long enough for something to shift in him in the wrong direction. He did not believe this in any dramatic way. He was not, by nature, a dramatic person. But he believed it quietly and firmly, the way he believed in the reliability of numbers. A small force applied at the right moment can change the direction of something entirely. This was physics. He had read about it. He had understood it. And he understood now, sitting on the step watching the boys with their can, that it was also true of bread, and of girls in blue headscarves, and of all the unremarkable acts of ordinary grace that happen in plain sight, and are almost immediately forgotten by everyone except the person who needed them most. His mother came home an hour later. He handed her the letter. She read it. She handed it back. She went to the stove and began to prepare dinner. After a moment, without turning around, she said, "Good." That was all. It was enough. It was, in its way, everything. The scholarship changed everything, but it did not change it overnight, and it did not change it easily. There was a gap between winning and arriving, a period of months during which Yusuf existed in Morand without quite belonging to it anymore, which is one of the stranger forms of loneliness. He had a future that the town could not contain. He still had a present that was entirely made of it. He finished the school year. He helped his mother. He read every book he could find. He walked the same streets he had always walked and noticed how well he knew their measurements, their angles, the way the afternoon shadow fell across the junction near the market, the precise distance from the bakery to his door. He was storing it, he realized later, the way you store something you know you will not see again for a long time. In September he left. His mother walked with him to the bus. She was carrying nothing, because she had nothing to carry for him. He had a bag with 2 changes of clothes and the books Mr. Karimi had given him, and the folded scholarship letter and enough money for 3 weeks, which was all the time he had before the university stipend would begin. They stood at the side of the road and waited for the bus without saying much. When it came and he stepped up, she put her hand briefly on his arm. Then she stepped back. He did not look back through the window. He had learned this from her. You move forward or you do not move. Tehran in 1961 was a city in the middle of becoming something it had not yet decided on. Streets were being widened. Buildings were being torn down and replaced. There was construction everywhere, and the smell of new concrete, and the sound of drills and machinery that started before sunrise and continued until long after dark. Yusuf arrived at the central bus station in the early evening and stood for a moment at the top of the steps with his bag in his hand, and the city spread out before him, and felt something he would not allow himself to name as fear. He named it instead as information. The city was large and fast and did not care about him. These were facts. He would work with them. The university was in the north of the city, up the long avenue that climbed toward the mountains. The mountains themselves were visible above the roofline on clear days, and Yusuf, who had grown up with mountains at his back, found this comforting in a way he did not examine too closely. He found the dormitory assigned to him, a room with 4 beds and 4 desks, and 1 window that looked at a wall. 3 of the beds were already occupied by the time he arrived. He set his bag on the 4th, introduced himself to the other 3, and went to find the library. The other 3 were named Oliver Nader, Fardin Gorbani, and a boy from Shiraz who was called Kasra, and who smelled permanently of cigarette smoke, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Persian poetry, and almost no knowledge of anything else. Oliver was serious and methodical, and came from a family with money, the kind of money that was not mentioned but was visible in everything from his watch to the condition of his shoes. Fardin was quick and funny, and spent a significant portion of his time organizing study groups that everyone attended, and that he himself contributed to the least. Kasra smoked and recited poetry and occasionally, with little warning and no apparent preparation, produced brilliant solutions to engineering problems that left his professors momentarily speechless. These 3 men would be Yusuf's closest companions for the next 5 years. He would learn more from them than he learned from most of his professors, not because they were smarter than the professors, but because you learn different things from people you eat dinner with and argue with at midnight and sit next to on long bus rides to field sites than you learn from people who write equations on a board. He was not, by temperament, an easy person to be close to. He knew this. He worked with it. He had a particular way of listening that some people found flattering and others found unnerving, a complete and focused attention that suggested he was recording everything, which he was. He was not cold. He laughed, and when he laughed it was genuine, and Oliver would later say that one of Yusuf's laughs was worth a week of ordinary amusement because of how rarely they came, and how entirely they committed when they did. But there was always behind the warmth a quality of distance, not unfriendliness, something more like self-sufficiency, as if he had arrived in the world already knowing that most of what he needed, he would have to provide for himself. He was a spectacular student. This was not a surprise to anyone who had spent more than 20 minutes with him, but it was still, in the scale of it, notable. He finished problem sets that took other students a week in an evening. He asked questions in lectures that caused professors to pause and then think, and then answer more carefully than they had intended to. He spent hours in the engineering library going through technical journals that were 10 and 15 years old, reading them the way other students read novels, for pleasure, for the story and the numbers, for the human ambition that lived inside every specification and load-bearing calculation. His scholarship covered his fees and a portion of his living costs. The rest he managed by tutoring other students in the evenings, which brought in a modest and reliable income, and had the additional benefit of forcing him to explain things he understood intuitively, in terms that other people could follow, which is a completely different skill, and one that many brilliant people never acquire. He tutored a boy named Edmund Blake in his second year, an exchange student from England who was good at theory and catastrophically bad at practical applications, the kind of student who could tell you the history of a bridge but could not, under any pressure, tell you whether the bridge would hold. Edmund was cheerful about his limitations in a way that Yusuf found initially baffling and eventually endearing. They worked together twice a week for a semester, and at the end of it, Edmund could pass his exams, and he was also, without quite realizing it, one of the few people outside Yusuf's dormitory room who had managed to get past the wall of focused competence and see something of the person behind it. Edmund once asked him, during a late-night session when they had both been working for too long and had reached the stage of tiredness where real conversations sometimes happen, what he actually wanted. Not what he was studying for, not what he planned to do with his degree, what he wanted. Yusuf thought about this for a moment. Then he said he wanted to build things that were still standing when he was dead. He said this without drama, as a statement of practical fact. Edmund looked at him for a moment, and then said that was the most serious thing anyone had said to him since he arrived in Iran, and possibly in his whole life. Yusuf said he did not think it was especially serious, he thought it was simply accurate. What he did not say, because it was not the kind of thing he said, was that he also wanted to show his mother's hands, not literally. He wanted to build something so solid and so useful that the story of his life, when it was eventually read backward, would make her hands make sense. All that cold and weight and rawness. It needed to mean something at the far end. He graduated at the top of his class in 1966. There was a ceremony. His mother came from Mirand on the bus, wearing the good black dress she had owned for as long as he could remember. She sat in the audience and watched him walk across the stage and receive his degree. He looked for her face from the stage and found it, and she looked back at him with an expression that was not pride exactly, or not only pride. It was the expression of a person who has placed a very careful bet over a very long time and is watching it come in. After the ceremony, he took her to a restaurant near the university, a real restaurant, with tablecloths and a menu. She sat across from him and looked at the menu for a long time. Then she put it down and said she would have whatever he was having. He ordered lamb stew and rice. They ate together at a white tablecloth table, his mother and the engineer her son had become, and neither of them said much, and it was the finest meal he ever ate in that city. 2 months after graduation, he was offered a position with a civil engineering firm in Tehran. The work was infrastructure, roads and bridges and drainage systems in the provinces, the kind of work that requires you to go to places that are on no map that matters to most people, and figure out how to connect them to the places that are. He accepted immediately and without negotiation, which the director of the firm later said was the single least financially intelligent thing he had ever seen a talented man do, and which Yusuf later conceded was probably correct. He did not care about the salary, he cared about the roads. He was assigned his first project in his second month. It was a stretch of road in the Alborz Mountains, in a valley where the existing track was impassable for 4 months of the year due to snow and mud, and a bridge that was held together by goodwill and a quality of structural faith that belonged more to religion than to engineering. The local villages were effectively cut off during those months. Supplies could not reach them. People could not leave. Children who became seriously ill in winter were a problem that the valley solved in ways that did not involve hospitals. Yusuf went to the valley and spent 2 weeks walking the terrain before he put a single figure on paper. He talked to the men who had driven the track for 20 years and knew every hazard in it. He talked to the farmers who had watched 3 bridges in the same location fail in the same way. He looked at the soil and the angle of the slopes and the behavior of the river when the spring melt came, and wrote 17 pages of notes in his small, careful handwriting. Then he drew the road. The design was simple and the solution was elegant, and it solved, in one stroke, 5 separate problems that previous engineers had treated as unrelated. His supervisor read it and said nothing for a moment, and then said he was going to need to check the calculations, and Yusuf said please do, and the supervisor did, and they were correct, and the road was built, and it has been standing ever since. Word travels. In engineering circles, the way it travels in small towns. People notice when something works, because there is enough that does not work that the contrast is striking. By the time Yusuf was 30, he had a reputation in the firm that extended beyond the firm, the kind of reputation that is made not of self-promotion but of solved problems, and that is therefore more durable and more persuasive than any other kind. He was also, by 30, a man who had not spoken to a woman outside of a professional context for longer than he cared to calculate. This was not a decision he had made. It was the result of 14-hour days and field assignments in remote valleys and a particular arrangement of priorities that did not, in the short term, leave room for anything that moved at the pace that human relationships require. His colleagues had wives and girlfriends and complicated domestic arrangements that they complained about with a cheerfulness that suggested the complaints were actually a form of affection. Yusuf listened to these complaints with genuine interest. He was not envious, exactly. He was observant. He filed away what people said about the ordinary business of being close to another person the way he filed away everything else, because information about the world was information about the world, regardless of whether you were currently making use of it. He was, however, lonely, in the specific and peculiar way that competent people are lonely, which is not the loneliness of having no one, but the loneliness of not being fully seen by anyone. He was surrounded by people who respected him and liked him, and sometimes even admired him. None of them knew about the schoolyard in Morand, or about his mother's hands, or about the precise weight of the piece of bread he had carried inside him for 18 years. He was not sure any of them would have known what to do with those things. He was not entirely sure he would have known how to give them. In the spring of 1971, he was sent to inspect a road project outside Kazvin, about 3 hours west of Tehran. The project was behind schedule and over budget, which was not unusual, but the reasons for it were, and the company wanted someone reliable to go and determine what was actually happening. Yusuf drove out on a cold Monday morning and spent the day on site and determined with reasonable certainty what was actually happening, which involved substandard materials and creative bookkeeping of a kind that was going to be somebody's serious problem very soon. He wrote his report that evening in his room at the local guest house, a clean and functional place owned by a family whose eldest son brought him tea without being asked, and whose daughter, when she came to change his towel, looked at the pages of his report spread across the table, with an expression of such frank curiosity that he asked her if she could read. She said yes. He asked what she was interested in. She said mathematics, which startled him. He asked her a question about mathematics. She answered it correctly. He asked her a harder question. She thought for a moment and answered that correctly too. Her name was Caroline Sadri. She was 19. Her father ran the guest house and her mother taught at the local school, and they had sent Caroline to the city for a year of further education, but brought her home when the costs had become too high. She was not angry about this, which was the first thing Yusuf noticed. She spoke about it with the same practical acceptance that he recognized from his own life, the quality of someone who understands that circumstances are facts, and facts are things you work with, not things you argue with. He talked to her for an hour that evening about mathematics and about engineering and about the road that he was there to investigate, and she asked good questions and followed his answers carefully, and said at one point something about the load distribution problem he was describing that was not correct but was interesting, and when he explained why it was not correct, she understood immediately and said, "Oh, I see, because the force is not uniform." He said that was exactly right. She smiled. It was, he thought, the most pleasant evening he had spent in a very long time. He drove back to Tehran the next morning. He thought about Caroline Sadri on the drive, and the thought was warm and genuine, and then it receded, the way thoughts do when the work reasserts itself. He filed his report. He moved to the next project. The next project was in a completely different province, and the one after that was in another direction entirely, and Caroline Sadri became a memory of a pleasant evening, and a girl who could do mathematics and a smile at the right answer, and that was the form the memory took. But Yusuf, who remembered everything, filed it where it belonged. The road through the Alborz Mountains had been standing for 3 years when Yusuf received a letter from the Ministry of Roads and Urban Development in Tehran. It was not the kind of letter that begins a conversation. It was the kind that changes one. He was 33. He had been running his own small engineering consultancy for 2 years by then, after leaving the firm with the kind of parting that is entirely civil on both sides and leaves behind a faint smell of inevitability, as if everyone involved had always known this was coming and had simply been waiting for it to arrange itself. The consultancy had 4 employees and more work than it could handle, because the reputation that had been accumulating since the Alborz Road had reached a point where it preceded him into rooms he had not yet entered. The letter from the ministry asked him if he would be willing to serve as a technical advisor on a national infrastructure program. The program was ambitious. It involved roads in provinces that had none worth the name, water systems in areas where water was a seasonal crisis, and bridges in 3 river valleys where the crossing question had been answered for decades by boats that were neither fast nor reliable nor safe. He read the letter twice, which was once more than he usually needed. Then he called his office manager, a formidable woman named Helen Morandi, who had the organizational capacity of a small army and the patience of someone who has raised 5 children and found engineering firms comparatively relaxing, and told her he was going to be unavailable for the next 4 months. Helen said she would rearrange the schedule. She said this in the tone of a person who has already thought of 3 solutions before the problem has finished being stated. He reported to the ministry on a Monday. The program was run by a deputy minister named Farrokh Motahari, who was a political man in the way that some men are political in their bones, meaning it was not something he did, but something he was. He shook Yusuf's hand with a politician's handshake, the grip calibrated precisely to convey both warmth and authority, and said he had heard a great deal about Yusuf's work. Yusuf said he hoped what he had heard was accurate. Motahari laughed, which was probably not the response he usually got from engineers. There were 12 other advisors on the program, from different disciplines, roads and hydrology and architecture and urban planning. They gathered on that first Monday in a conference room on the 4th floor of the ministry building, and Yusuf looked at them and correctly assessed that half of them were excellent at what they did, and the other half were there for reasons that had more to do with who they knew than what they knew. He did not say this. He sat down and opened his notebook and began listening. The project that was assigned to him as his primary responsibility was in the south of the country, in a region of salt flats and fierce heat where the ground itself seemed to be against the idea of infrastructure. 3 villages had been waiting for a connecting road for a decade. The terrain was unforgiving in ways that were specifically interesting to Yusuf, because the problems it presented were problems that had not been previously solved in this particular combination, and therefore required thinking rather than application. He spent 6 weeks in the south. He was the only engineer in the team who insisted on spending that much time on site, which created some friction with the ministry officials who wanted reports on a schedule. He wrote them the reports and kept spending time on site. He was polite and consistent and immovable in the way of someone who has learned that this particular combination is more effective than argument. He came back to Tehran with a design that solved the heat expansion problem in the surface material, which was something 3 previous attempts at this road had failed to address properly, and which had caused each of them to develop catastrophic cracking within 2 years. His solution used a combination of material specification and joint spacing that was not new in isolation, but that he had adapted to this specific terrain in a way that was new, and that would, he was confident, hold. He presented this to the program team. The other advisors received it politely. Motahari's deputy, a man named George Tehrani who was 28 and had a master's degree from a European university, and a manner that suggested he was aware of both these facts at all times, asked several questions that were intended to sound technical, and were actually political, meaning they were designed to explore the question of whose credit this would be, rather than whether the road would work. Yusuf answered them without acknowledgement of their actual purpose, which he understood perfectly, and George Tehrani eventually ran out of questions and sat back. The road was approved. It was built. It held. It held through 3 summers of extreme heat. It held through 2 years of the kind of political disruption that causes governments to stop maintaining infrastructure because they are occupied with more urgent problems. It held because it was designed to hold, and because Yusuf had spent 6 weeks making sure the design was right. During those ministry years, which ran from 1972 to 1977, Yusuf moved into a different social world. This was not entirely his choice. It was the consequence of being excellent at something that powerful people valued, and of being invited to the places where powerful people gathered to discuss the things they valued. He had a good suit made. He learned the rhythms of those rooms, when to speak and when to listen, and when to say something precise and technical in a way that cut through the comfortable vagueness of political conversation like a blade through cloth. People found him impressive, which was new. They had found him competent before. Impressive was a different category. It was in this world that he first met Nazrin Pourali. She was 27, which made her 5 years younger than him. Her father was a senior official in the Ministry of Finance, a man with a distinguished face and the quiet authority of someone who has been powerful for long enough that the power has become invisible, merged into the ordinary texture of who he is. Nasreen had inherited the authority but not the quiet. She was not loud. She was vivid, which is something else entirely. She wore colors that other women in those rooms did not wear. She asked questions that the other women in those rooms did not ask. She had a degree in economics from the University of Tehran, and a mind that moved laterally, making connections between things that appeared unrelated, which is a form of intelligence that Yusuf recognized and respected. They met at a dinner at the home of a deputy minister, one of those Tehran dinner parties of the mid-70s where the food was excellent and the conversation was a performance, and everyone in the room understood that everyone else in the room was networking, which somehow made the networking both more and less comfortable. Yusuf was at these dinners because he was useful to the ministry. Nasreen was there because her father was at these dinners and she often accompanied him. They were seated across from each other at a long table and they argued, politely and with considerable precision, about the relationship between infrastructure investment and agricultural productivity in the southern provinces, which was a subject about which Yusuf knew a great deal from direct experience, and about which Nasreen had thoughts that were theoretically sophisticated and empirically weak. He told her this because he was not, in matters of fact, inclined toward social diplomacy. He did it without condescension, simply as a correction, the way you tell someone they have misremembered a date. She received it the way someone receives a correction who is confident enough in their intelligence to be interested in being wrong rather than embarrassed by it. She asked him why he thought her empirical basis was weak. He explained. She considered this. She asked 2 more questions. Then she said he was right and moved on to her next point. And Yusuf, who was accustomed to defending his positions against people who had stopped listening in order to formulate their response, found this unexpectedly refreshing. They talked for the rest of the dinner. When it ended and the guests were finding their coats, she gave him a card with her telephone number and said she would like to continue the conversation. He called her 4 days later, which was not how long it took him to decide to call, but how long it took him to accept that he was going to. Nasreen was unlike anyone Yusuf had spent serious time with. She was connected to the structures of power in Tehran in the way that certain people are connected, not through their own ambition but through the fact of their parentage, which is a different and more complex situation, because it means the power is real, but not quite theirs, and they must constantly decide what to do with that. She introduced Yusuf to people whose names he had seen on documents and in newspapers. She brought him into rooms where decisions that affected his work were made by men who did not entirely understand what they were deciding. She did this without calculation, or not entirely with calculation, because she also simply liked him and wanted the people she liked to know each other. What she brought him, in the terms the world would use, was access, political connection, a certain kind of social legitimacy that was different from the professional legitimacy he already had, and that opened different kinds of doors. He understood this. He was honest with himself about accepting it. He also understood that what she received from him was something she valued equally, which was someone who would disagree with her on facts, without apology and without softening it, and who was not managing a position in relation to her father, and therefore had no reason to be dishonest. They were together for almost 2 years. It was not a simple relationship, and he was not, in the ordinary sense, easy to be in a relationship with. But it was real, in the way that things are real when both people are genuinely trying and are genuinely changed by the effort. What ended it was not a dramatic event. It was a gradual recognition, reached at different speeds by both of them, that they wanted different things from the future and that neither of them was wrong to want what they wanted. Nasreen wanted, eventually, to step into her family's world, to be part of the ongoing project of a family with influence, and to build her own version of that influence inside a particular social structure. Yusuf wanted, eventually, to be somewhere more quiet and more direct, where the work spoke for itself. These were not incompatible on the surface, but they were, in the accumulated daily texture of a shared life, pulling in different directions. They parted without bitterness and with a great deal of mutual respect, which is rarer than it should be, and which Yusuf would always count as something he was proud of. She went on, within 2 years, to marry a man from a family that her father approved of, and to build a life that suited her. Yusuf heard of this through mutual acquaintances and was glad, and the gladness was genuine and uncomplicated, which told him something useful about what they had been to each other. The political world he had entered through Nasreen did not close when she left it. He had made his own presence in it by then. He had built roads that members of parliament used as evidence of progress in their speeches. He had been cited in policy documents. He had sat across tables from men whose decisions shaped the direction of whole provinces and had said, with the quiet certainty of someone who has measured the ground under his feet, that the design was correct and the road would hold. He was, by 1976, a man who mattered, not in the largest sense, not yet, but in the specific sense of being someone whose presence in a room slightly changes the quality of what gets decided there. He had arrived at this position carrying almost nothing from Mirand except his mother's lesson about dignity and a piece of bread he had eaten alone in a schoolyard 19 years before, and which remained, in the geography of his memory, as fixed and as clear as any coordinate on any map he had ever drawn. He thought about Mariam Sadeghi sometimes, in the way you think about something so deeply stored that it surfaces only in particular kinds of silence. He did not know where she was. He had not tried to find out, not yet, not because he did not intend to, but because he was not ready. In some way he did not fully understand, and because the world had not yet given him the right stillness to do it in. He carried the intention the way he carried everything important, quietly, precisely, without losing it. He was 37 in 1977, and the world, which had been moving at its own pace all this time, was about to move very suddenly, in a direction that no one had fully anticipated, and the life Yusuf had built with such patient, careful effort was about to encounter the thing that careful, patient effort cannot always prevent, which is history. The woman who brought him capital arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of unremarkable detail that seems wrong in retrospect, as if important things should choose more significant days. Her name was Shirin Amiri, and she walked into the meeting that Yusuf's office manager Helen had arranged, with the tone of someone who has never once in her life walked into a room without knowing exactly why she was there. She was 41. She had built, from a starting point that was almost nothing, a trading business that moved goods between Tehran and several European capitals and that had a reputation, in the circles where such things were assessed, for reliability. In a business where reliability is rarer than talent, this was the thing that made her. She had started with fabric, good fabric, the kind that European buyers would pay for and that she could source in Iran at a cost that made the margins work. She had understood, before most people in her position understood, that what the European market wanted was not just the fabric but the story attached to it, and she had become as skilled at telling the story as at sourcing the goods. By the time she met Yusuf, her business had expanded into construction materials and equipment, which is how she came to be in his office. She needed an engineer's assessment of a supply contract. She wanted to know whether the specifications she had been given were accurate, or whether, as she suspected, someone in the supply chain was substituting lower quality goods and pocketing the difference. She had been told by someone she trusted that Yusuf was the person to ask. He looked at the specifications. He asked 4 questions. She answered them without hesitation, and without the evasiveness that people sometimes deploy when they are not entirely sure what they want from a conversation. Then he told her that her suspicion was correct and explained, with the calm precision that was his default register, exactly which specifications were wrong and by how much, and what the structural consequences would be in the medium term. She listened to all of this without interrupting and without taking notes, because she had the kind of memory that did not need paper, and then she said, "How much to put that in writing with full technical backing?" He quoted her a number. She agreed to it without negotiation, which told him something about her that the whole of the preceding conversation had not. They worked together on the assessment over the following 2 weeks. She came to his office 3 times, and he went to her offices once, and they had 2 telephone conversations, in all of which she was direct and precise, and moved through information at a pace that he found comfortable, because it was close to his own. She did not perform in meetings. She did not set up positions and defend them. She assessed, decided, moved. When the work was done and she had what she needed, she said, over tea at the end of their final meeting, that she had been told he was good and that he was in fact considerably better than good, and that she hoped they would work together again. He said he would welcome that. She stood to leave, and then paused at the door and asked, not in a flirtatious way but in the direct way she did everything, whether he would like to have dinner. He said yes, because it was the honest answer. The dinner was at a restaurant in northern Tehran, where the food was excellent, and the room was quiet and well lit. They talked for 3 hours. She told him about the business in the specific way that people who love their work talk about it, with an energy that is not performance but the natural result of caring about something deeply, and rarely finding someone willing to listen at the same level of detail. He listened in the way he always listened, with complete attention that she recognized immediately because it was unusual, and she was the kind of person who noticed unusual things. He told her about the Southern Road, about the 6 weeks on site, about the heat expansion problem. She asked about the material solution and he explained it, and she followed it precisely, and at one point made a connection between the supply chain problem he was describing and the materials contracts in her own business that was perceptive and accurate and unexpected. He said so. She said she had been buying and selling construction materials for 4 years and had learned more than she had intended. What she brought him, across the year that followed, was a different kind of world than the one Nasreen had opened. Nasreen's world was Tehran political society, the dinner parties and the ministry corridors, and the careful management of relationship hierarchies. Shireen's world was economic. It was the world of contracts and capital and the flow of goods and money across borders, a world that was pragmatic and international and moved faster than the political world because it was driven by a different kind of pressure. She introduced him to European clients who were looking at Iranian infrastructure projects. She connected him with international engineering firms whose methods and materials he had been reading about in journals for years. She opened, in practical terms, a channel between his work and a much larger pool of resources and opportunity than he had previously been able to access. She also brought him capital in the more direct sense. She invested in 2 of his infrastructure projects as a commercial investor, because she saw, with her trader's eye for what is undervalued by the market, that what Yusuf built was worth more than it cost, and that the margins over time would be significant. She was right about this. She was right about most things that could be assessed through a clear financial lens and a willingness to look at information without wanting it to say something particular. They were together for 14 months, and the relationship was real and mutual, and conducted by both of them with the kind of honesty that is only possible between 2 people who have both spent enough time alone to know the difference between what they want and what they are supposed to want. She did not want, at 41, a conventional domestic life. He did not want to be someone's project. These facts made the space between them less complicated than it might otherwise have been. What ended it was geography, in the most literal sense. In late 1977, with the political situation in Tehran shifting in ways that she had assessed before most people had begun to notice, Shireen made the decision to move the center of her business operations to Paris. This was not a panic, it was a calculation. She had been watching the pattern of events for 18 months and she had concluded, correctly, that the window for an orderly exit was narrower than it appeared and that the time to move was now rather than later. She offered Yusuf a role in the European side of the operation. He thought about it for 2 days, which was longer than he usually needed, and then said no. He said it with regret that was genuine and without explanation that was sufficient, because the actual explanation was this: he was not yet finished with what he had come to build, and he could only build it here, in this specific terrain, in this specific country, where the problems were his, and the land was under his feet. Shirin understood this, because she was a person of clarity, and she did not try to change his mind. She left in January of 1978. They remained in contact by letter, irregular and genuine, for many years. The business she built in Paris became something significant in the construction materials trade in Western Europe. She was, by all accounts, exactly as formidable in Paris as she had been in Tehran, which surprised no one who had met her. He missed her in the specific way you miss someone whose particular form of intelligence has become something you relied on. Not emotionally dependent in the way that leaves you unable to function, but calibrated on. The way your eyes adjust to a certain quality of light and then need time to adjust again when it changes. The third woman came later in that same year, in the spring of 1978, which was a season in Tehran that was strange in a way that is hard to describe to people who were not there. There was a feeling in the air, not panic, not yet, but something like the atmospheric pressure change before a storm. That particular heaviness that is both threatening and somehow exciting if you have never been through a storm before and therefore do not know what the heaviness means. Her name was Layla Soltani, and she was the daughter of a prominent industrialist who had made his fortune in textiles and spent a significant portion of it on the collection of art and the hosting of events that brought together the people who made up Tehran's cultural and social elite. Layla had grown up in that world and wore it the way some people wear clothes that have been made for them specifically, with ease and precision and an assumption that the fit is correct. She was 34. She had a degree in art history from a European university and had spent 2 years working in a gallery in Milan before returning to Tehran to manage the family's art collection, which was considerable. She had also, in ways that were less public, become a trusted advisor to several families on the question of moving valuable assets discreetly, which was a skill that was becoming more relevant by the month, in a city where the question of asset safety was increasingly not rhetorical. She and Yusuf met at an exhibition opening at a private gallery in northern Tehran. He was there because the gallery owner had a building project and had invited him hoping to discuss it somewhere with better food than his office. Layla was there because she knew the gallery owner and the artist and had helped organize the event. They were introduced by the host and stood together in front of a large canvas that Yusuf looked at with the concentrated attention of someone who is trying very hard to understand something, and Layla looked at with the confident pleasure of someone for whom this kind of beauty is a familiar language. She asked him what he thought of the painting. He said he did not know enough about painting to have a useful opinion. She said she found that more interesting than a performed opinion. He asked what made it interesting. She said that most men at these events had opinions about paintings the way they had opinions about wines they had not tasted. The opinion existed to establish a position rather than to communicate a genuine response. He said he supposed that was true, and that he found it a waste of time, and that if he were going to form a genuine opinion about painting he would need to learn about painting properly, which he had not yet found the time to do. She looked at him for a moment and then laughed, and the laugh was genuine and warm. She said she admired the methodology, if not the current gap in his education. He said he admired her ability to tell the difference. Layla was different from Nasrin and different from Shireen in ways that were not immediately obvious because the surface was equally assured in all three. What was different was the texture of what she valued. Nasrin valued influence in the political sense, the ability to shape what got decided and by whom. Shireen valued the clean reality of commercial success, the exact and verifiable satisfaction of a deal that works. Layla valued beauty and continuity, the preservation of things worth keeping, and the social architecture that allowed the people who valued the same things to find each other. She brought Yusuf into a world of a different kind of gathering. Not political dinners and ministry corridors, not the international commerce network, but the salons and collections and private concerts and gallery openings that made up Tehran's cultural life. He was not immediately comfortable in this world. He was aware, with some frequency, of being the person in the room who knew the least about what the room was ostensibly about. But he was also aware that being the person who knew the most about load-bearing walls and soil stability, and the behavior of water in dry terrain, made him useful in ways that had value in this world too, because the people in it owned buildings and estates, and had practical problems alongside their aesthetic ones. She taught him about painting, not as a course of instruction but as a continuous, informal running commentary on what she was looking at and why it mattered. He learned in the way he always learned, thoroughly and with the underlying intention of actually understanding rather than merely accumulating. By the end of their first year together, he could stand in front of a canvas and have a genuine opinion about it, which was not the same opinion Layla would have, but which was his, arrived at honestly, and she respected this more than she would have respected agreement. What she brought him, in the terms the world would use, was status and social visibility of a particular kind. He appeared in photographs from her family's events. He was introduced at dinners as not just an engineer but a notable one. His name began to appear in the social columns that documented the gatherings of Tehran's upper class, which was a form of presence he had never sought and did not quite know what to do with, but which, he understood, had its own practical value, in a world where the question of who you were seen with was not entirely separate from the question of what you could accomplish. He cared about her. He cared about her with a warmth and a genuine admiration that was real and uncomplicated by the specific pressures that had complicated the previous relationships. What they had together was, in some ways, the most relaxed and most genuinely pleasurable relationship he had been in. She did not make demands on him that required him to be other than he was. She was interested in him for what he actually was, not for what she wanted him to become. In return, he was present with her in a way that he had learned, by now, to be present, completely, honestly, without managing the impression he was making. The spring of 1978 moved into the summer. The summer was not like other summers. The news from the street was different from the news on the radio, and neither of them matched what people said to each other in private. Yusuf drove through parts of the city he normally did not drive through, and saw things that his engineering eye read as precursors to larger disruptions, the structural signs of something under pressure that is about to change its shape. He kept working. There was always more work. He drove to sites and assessed problems and came home to Layla's elegant apartment and ate dinner and listened to music that she had chosen carefully and that he was learning to hear the way she heard it, for its internal structure as well as its surface beauty. He was happy, in the specific and somewhat suspicious way that happiness presents itself when you are a person who has never quite expected it. And the world, which had its own momentum and no interest in individual happiness as a consideration, kept building toward what was coming. He could see it in the faces of the men at the ministry, in the changed tone of conversations at Layla's dinners, in the number of families he knew who had quietly moved money abroad. He could see it the way he could always see the precursors to failure in a structure under stress, the small cracks and the uneven settlements and the moment when the load distribution begins to shift. He did not know what was coming in its specific form. No one did, entirely. But he knew that the thing that was coming was large, and that large things, when they arrive, do not arrive alone. The revolution came in February of 1979 and rewrote the country in the specific way that revolutions rewrite countries, which is not all at once but in a cascading sequence of alterations that keep arriving after the main event, each one changing the shape of the one before it, until the original arrangement is so far behind you that it requires an effort of will to remember it clearly. Yusuf was at a construction site outside Tehran on the day the final collapse of the old government became official. He was standing on a half-built bridge over a river tributary that ran through a valley north of the city. The news came over the radio of the foreman's truck. The men on the site stood and listened, and then several of them embraced, and several of them went quiet in the way of people who understand that the thing they have wanted has arrived but now have to figure out what it means. He drove back to Tehran that evening, through streets that were unrecognizable in their energy. People on every corner, and the sound of it coming through his car windows. Not exactly celebration, not exactly grief, something more complicated than either. The sound of a very large number of people who have been waiting for a long time to feel something, and are now feeling it, and none of them are entirely sure yet whether the feeling is the right one. He drove to Layla's apartment. She was there with her father and two of her father's oldest friends, men in their 60s who sat in the best chairs with the stillness of people who have survived enough history to know that moments of high emotion are not the right time for decisions. They drank tea. They listened to the radio. They talked about what they knew and more about what they did not know. Yusuf sat at the edge of this gathering and listened and measured what he was hearing against what he had observed over the preceding months. And what he concluded was that the next year was going to be very difficult for people who had been visible in the previous arrangement. He was not wrong. The months that followed moved with a speed and a logic that was not legible from the inside. Decisions were made by people who were themselves uncertain of what they were deciding, and who were also being decided upon by forces larger than any of them. The ministry he had worked with was reorganized several times in the space of a year. Some of his ministry contacts disappeared, not in the worst sense, but in the sense of becoming abruptly and completely unreachable, which has its own particular quality of uncertainty. His projects were reviewed, some were continued. Others were simply stopped, mid-process, with no documentation of why, with materials on site and foundations poured, and workers who had been on a payroll that was now discontinued. He kept his head down, which is a phrase that sounds passive but in practice requires constant active attention. He went to his office. He did his work. He was scrupulous in his dealings with the new authorities, and careful in his speech in ways that felt unnatural to him, because he had always been a direct person, but which he understood were not optional. He was not afraid in the way that people who were connected to the previous government in political ways were afraid. He was an engineer. He had built roads. The new government also needed roads. But he had been associated with people who were now associated with the wrong things, and that association had a weight that he was aware of at all times. Nasreen's family retracted so quietly that the retraction was almost imperceptible. Nasreen herself wrote him a letter in March of 1979 that was carefully worded in ways that told him more about how much worse things were than she was able to say, than about the content of what she was actually saying. Her father had retired. Her brother had left the country. She did not mention the dinners or the ministry corridors or any of the things that had constituted their shared world, because those things no longer existed in any form that could be safely mentioned. She ended the letter by saying she hoped he was well, and that she thought of him sometimes. He wrote back briefly and with similar care. They did not communicate again for several years. Shireen was already in Paris. She wrote to him from there, less carefully because she was not inside the thing and could afford a different register. She said the business was establishing itself, and that her offer was still open. She said she had access to European construction projects that needed his expertise, and that she would pay him well, and that he should think about it seriously. He wrote back and said he was thinking about it seriously. He was not lying. He was thinking about it, and concluding each time that the answer was still no. Layla was the one who stayed longest, because staying was more deeply part of her nature than it was of Shirin's, and because the things she was trying to preserve, the art, the continuity, the social architecture of a world worth living in, was not portable in the way that Shirin's business was portable. She could not pack the paintings and the library and the circles of people she had spent her life building and take them to another city, so she stayed. They remained together through the first, most turbulent year. He was honest with her about what he was seeing, and she was honest with him about what it was costing her, which was considerable. Her father's gallery had been taken under new management. Two of her oldest friends had left the country. The events and the openings and the dinners that had structured her world were either stopped or had changed in character so completely that they no longer felt like the same thing. She attended some of them because she was not a person who gave up easily on anything, but she came home from them with a tiredness that was not physical. In the summer of 1980, the war with Iraq began. This changed the nature of everything again. Yusuf was, by this point, working almost entirely in the private sector, on building projects and small-scale infrastructure for private clients. because the government projects were moving through an administrative process that was slow and unpredictable, and required a form of political navigation that he had decided he was not going to spend his energy on. He had 3 projects running. He managed them with the same precision he had always brought to work, because the work was still the work, regardless of what was happening at the level above it. In the late autumn of that year, Layla told him she was going to join her sister in London. She said it with the matter-of-fact sadness of someone who has thought about a thing for a long time before saying it, and is therefore past the emotional peak of it by the time it comes out. Her sister had left a year earlier. Layla had held on, she said, as long as it made sense to hold on. She could not reconstruct what she valued here anymore. She could not see the path from where things were now to anything that resembled the world she believed in. He did not try to persuade her to stay. He understood her reasoning, and he respected it, and he was sad, with a sadness that was clean and without recrimination, because she was not abandoning him. She was going towards something that made sense, and he was choosing not to go, and both of these were legitimate choices made by 2 people who knew themselves well enough to know what they could not do. She left on a gray morning in November. He drove her to the airport and helped with the luggage and stood in the departure area for a moment. She put her hand against the side of his face briefly, the way you touch something you are leaving because you want to have touched it recently, and then she walked through the gate. He drove back to Tehran on an empty road, and the absence of her was very specific, and he felt it the way you feel a missing tooth, with a precise and persistent awareness of the space where the thing was. Back in the city, in the apartment he had moved into in 1977, he sat down at his desk and looked at the current project files stacked neatly by Helen's system. 3 months of work, specifications, cost analyses, 2 letters to suppliers that needed to go out before the end of the week. He put on his reading glasses and picked up the first file and began to read. This was what he knew how to do. When the world contracted, you made the work larger. When relationships ended and political ground shifted and the city outside the window became something you had to navigate differently, the work remained the work. The calculations did not change because of circumstances. The concrete did not care about the revolution. The soil behaved according to its properties regardless of what was being said on the radio. He had been stripped back to the essentials, and the essentials, it turned out, were the same essentials he had started with: a mind that held facts, a set of skills that solved real problems, a standard, held quietly in the back of everything, against which he measured what he did and how he did it. The standard was not a rule he had written down. It was the memory of a schoolyard and a dry fountain and a girl who had looked at a boy at his lowest point and had done the simplest possible thing and had not waited to be thanked. He had been surrounded, in the years before this, by gold and by power and by the access they brought, and by women who were remarkable in their different ways and who had given him real things that had genuinely enriched his life. He was grateful for all of it. He did not diminish any of it. And yet, in this stripped-back apartment in a changed city, what he returned to was not any of it. What he returned to was bread on a stone and the sound of footsteps walking away. That was the thing that had never moved. He pulled a piece of paper toward him and wrote at the top of it, in his careful handwriting, the name Maryam Sadeghi. Below it he wrote the year 1957 and the word Morand. Below that he wrote, because he was an engineer, and engineers begin with what they know, everything he could remember about her family. Her father's name, which he was not sure of but thought was Muhammad, the bakery on the street 2 blocks from his mother's house, the blue headscarf, the approximate age, which would make her now in her mid-30s, a brother, he thought, though he was not certain. He folded the piece of paper and put it in the back of his desk drawer. He was not ready to begin the search yet. He did not know why, but he knew his own timing well enough to trust it. The right moment would come. When it came, he would know. He pulled the piece of paper from the drawer in the spring of 1981. Not because he had decided to act on it that day in particular, but because it was there, and the morning had been quiet, and something in the quiet felt like the right kind of space for it. He unfolded it and read what he had written, and then added to it, because 2 years had passed and he had remembered more. He remembered that the bakery was on the corner of 2 streets whose names he could no longer recall exactly, but whose position in relation to the mosque and the market he could reconstruct from the map of his childhood that his memory kept intact. He remembered that her father had been a large man with a loud, comfortable laugh. He remembered a detail he had not thought of in years, that she had worn the bread tucked under her left arm, which meant she was left-handed, or had simply been carrying something in her right. A small fact, but small facts are sometimes the ones that lead somewhere. He had resources now that he had not had before. Not great resources, because the preceding 2 years had been expensive in more ways than one, but enough. He had colleagues in different cities. He had the kind of professional network that a man builds over 20 years of building things in places where other people are trying to build things, and that network has uses beyond the professional, because people know people and towns are smaller than cities and cities are smaller than the full extent of what people know. He wrote 3 letters, one to an old university colleague named Dariush who had returned to the Northwest and was practicing architecture in Tabriz and who would know, or would know someone who knew, the kind of local information that does not appear on any official register. One to a former client in Marand itself, a man named Hassan who had hired him 10 years earlier to assess a commercial building, and who had struck Yusuf as a man who knew everything about everyone in the town, in the way that certain people in small towns are the involuntary repositories of collective memory. And one to a former ministry contact who had survived the transition and who was now working in a regional development office and who owed him a professional favor of the kind that does not expire. He wrote the letters with care. He did not explain more than he needed to explain, which was that he was looking for a family named Sadeghi, who had run a bakery in Marand until sometime in the early to mid-70s, and specifically for a daughter of that family named Maryam, whose current whereabouts he would like to know. He said she was an old acquaintance. He did not say more. He sent the letters and then he went back to work, because waiting was not something he did differently from not waiting. Life continued at its own pace regardless, and he had 3 private projects to manage, and a site visit in Isfahan at the end of the week, and a dispute between 2 clients about a shared drainage system that needed his technical assessment before it became a legal dispute, which it was showing every sign of becoming. Dariush wrote back in 3 weeks. He did not know the family personally but had asked around and believed that the baker Mohammed Sadeghi had died in approximately 1972 or 1973, that the bakery had subsequently been sold, and that the family, which included the wife and at least 2 children, had moved. He had heard Tabriz mentioned but was not certain. He would continue to ask if that was helpful. Hassan wrote back in 5 weeks, which was not surprising because Hassan was a man who did things at his own pace and seemed mildly offended by urgency. He reported, with the particular satisfaction of someone who knows more than you thought they would, that yes, he remembered the Sadeghi family, that Mohammed Sadeghi had been a good man and a good baker, that he had died of a heart problem when his children were still young, and that the wife, whose name was Zara, had eventually gone to live with her daughter, who had married a schoolteacher from Tabriz. The daughter's name was Maryam. The schoolteacher's name Hassan did not know, but he knew that they were in Tabriz. The ministry contact did not respond for 2 months. And when he did, it was brief, and said only that his ability to access the kind of records that Yusuf was interested in was limited at present, and that he was sorry he could not be more helpful. Yusuf thanked him and did not pursue it. Tabriz was a city Yusuf knew. He had done work in the region and had been there several times over the years, most recently in 1978, and he had the city in his memory as a specific landscape of streets and districts. He knew people there. He wrote to Dariush again, this time with the additional information from Hassan, asking whether he could help identify a schoolteacher who had married a woman named Maryam Sadeghi from Marand, sometime in the late 60s or early 70s. Dariush found him in 6 weeks. His name was Reza Kargar, and he taught mathematics and physics at a secondary school in the eastern part of the city. He and his wife had 3 children. He was well regarded at the school. He had been there for 12 years. Yusuf sat with this information for 2 weeks. He was not procrastinating. He was thinking, which is different, and which he did seriously and without rushing. He was thinking about what exactly he intended to do with the information he had, and what he would say when he arrived, and what arriving at the door of a woman he had not spoken to since 1957 would look like to her. He was thinking about whether it was a reasonable thing to do, and whether it was, in some way he could not entirely articulate, necessary. He concluded that it was both. He drove to Tabriz on a Friday morning in the autumn of 1983. He drove alone, in the car he had bought the previous year, a practical and unremarkable vehicle that suited him in the same way that his clothes suited him, not as an expression of status but as an appropriate tool for the work of getting from one place to another. The road north was long, and through changing landscape, and he drove it with the attentiveness he brought to anything that mattered, watching the land the way he always watched it, for what it told him about what was underneath. He arrived in Tabriz in the early afternoon. He had Reza Kargar's home address, which Dariush had obtained from a teacher he knew at the school. He drove to the district, parked several streets away, and walked. It was a residential neighborhood, quiet on a Friday afternoon, the streets mostly empty, the sound of a television from somewhere, and the smell of cooking from several directions at once. The houses were concrete, modest but well kept, with small gardens behind low walls. He stopped outside the house and stood for a moment. He was not nervous in the ordinary sense. He was aware, with a precision that he brought to all significant moments, of the weight of what he was about to do. He was going to knock on the door of a woman who had done something small and unremarkable 26 years ago, and who had almost certainly not thought about it since, and he was going to sit in her home and look at the life she had made, and carry inside himself the things she did not know she had given him. He knocked. The door was opened by a boy of about 12, which caused Yusuf a moment of vertigo that he would not have expected. A boy of about 12, opening a door. He introduced himself and said he was an old acquaintance of the family, and asked if Mrs. Karger was home. The boy went back inside, and Yusuf heard footsteps and a brief, muffled exchange. She appeared in the doorway. He had not known what he expected. He had carried her in his memory as a girl of 12 in a blue headscarf, which is not how a 40-year-old woman looks, and the gap between the memory and the person standing in front of him required a small internal adjustment. She was a woman of about his own age, slightly built, with her hair covered and her expression currently set to the polite neutrality that doors are opened with when you do not know who is on the other side. She looked at him and did not recognize him. He said his name. He said it clearly, giving both names, and he watched her face. For a moment, nothing. Her eyes held the polite attention of someone waiting for the context that will make sense of an unfamiliar name. He could see her going through her internal inventory of people she knew, trying to locate him, and not finding him, and preparing the expression that would accompany the polite admission that she was sorry, she did not think they had met. And then something shifted. It was not dramatic. It was not a sudden gasp or a hand to the mouth. It was smaller than that. Her eyes changed before anything else did. The specific change that happens when a memory surfaces that is real but old and comes from such a distance that it arrives slightly blurred. She looked at him with this expression for a long moment, the expression of someone seeing through the present face to the one behind it. Then she remembered. Not who he had become. He could see that clearly. She did not remember the name from newspapers or ministry documents. She remembered the boy, the schoolyard, the fountain, the ground. She put her hand over her mouth, not dramatically, not as a performance, but in the instinctive way you cover the thing a face does when you are not ready for it to do it in front of a stranger. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had been waiting for 26 years and a few more seconds were nothing. After a moment she took her hand away and said, in a voice that was not quite steady, Yusuf Karimi. She said it as a confirmation rather than a question, the way you say a thing you know is true but need to hear yourself say. He said yes. She stepped back from the door. She said, please come in. He came in. The hallway was narrow and the house smelled of the afternoon meal, and somewhere deeper in the building a child was practicing a musical instrument, with a determination that exceeded its current skill level. She led him to the sitting room, which was clean and simply furnished with the careful arrangement of people who take pride in a space and do not have much to spend on it. She offered him tea. He said yes, because refusing tea in someone's home is a different kind of conversation from accepting it. He heard her in the kitchen, heard the sound of the kettle and the cups, and he sat in the sitting room and looked at the photographs on the shelf. 3 children in different combinations. A husband in what looked like a school photograph, serious-faced and a little uncomfortable with the camera. An older woman who might be the mother, Zara, the woman who had been left a widow in a town with a bakery that no longer existed. She came back with the tea and sat across from him, and they looked at each other across the small table, with the particular quality of attention that exists between 2 people who are both carrying something and are not yet sure how to set it down. She asked him how he had found her. The question was asked with a tone that was curious rather than alarmed, the tone of a person who is genuinely interested in the answer, which told him something about her that the preceding minutes had already begun to suggest, that she was a person who met life with a kind of forthright attention, who asked what she wanted to know rather than circling it. He told her honestly. He said he had asked colleagues in Morand and in Tabriz, that it had taken 2 years of intermittent inquiry, that her father's death had been confirmed and her move to Tabriz established, and her husband's school identified through a network of professional contacts. He said all of this plainly, without softening it, because softening it would have suggested that it needed to be softened, and he did not believe that it did. She listened to this with her teacup held in both hands and her eyes on him, and then she said, "You spent 2 years looking for me." He said yes. She said why. He had thought about this moment, not obsessively, not in the way of someone who has rehearsed, but in the quiet, private way of someone who believes in thinking about important things before saying them. He had a version of the answer that was simple and another that was more complete, and he decided, looking at her, that she was a person who deserved the more complete one. He told her about the schoolyard. He told her what the morning had been like. He told her about the wobbling desk and the chalk that ran out and the teacher who smelled of tobacco and disinfectant and who had walked him to the courtyard and left him there. He told her about the dry fountain and the pomegranate tree and the way the sky had looked. He told her that he had not eaten that morning and that the emptiness had been a particular kind that day, not just physical but something else, something that had made the edges of things unsteady. He told her that she had not looked at him when she put the bread down. He told her that she had not waited. He told her that he had eaten the bread slowly, sitting on the cold stone, and that something in him that had been shaken had settled back into its right position. He told her that he had never forgotten it. He said this plainly, as a fact, without sentiment around it. She looked at him for a long time after he stopped speaking. The child somewhere in the house had stopped practicing the instrument. The house was quiet around them. The tea was getting cold. Then she said, "I don't remember doing it." He said he had assumed as much. She frowned slightly, not at him but at the information itself. The way you frown when you are trying to see something clearly that is slightly out of focus. She said she thought she remembered him. She thought she could place the name now, and a face that was very different from the one in front of her. A thin boy with a serious expression. But she did not remember the bread. She said she was sorry. She seemed genuinely sorry, as if the forgetting was a fault in her rather than an ordinary fact about the way memory works. He said there was nothing to be sorry for. He said that was precisely the point. He said that the reason it had stayed with him was not that she had done something enormous or memorable. It was that she had done something entirely ordinary for its own sake, without pausing to make it significant, and had then walked away before it could become significant in any direction that required anything from her. He said he had met, since that morning, a great many people who were capable of large gestures and very few who were capable of that one. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought he was giving an ordinary moment more credit than it deserved. He said, with a gentleness he very rarely deployed, that this was because she had never been the person sitting on the ground when it happened. They sat together with this for a while. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward evening. The sound of Reza Kargar arriving home came through the door, keys and footsteps and the voices of the children redistributing themselves through the house to greet him. Yusuf stood. He said he did not want to intrude on the family's evening. He said he had wanted to meet her, and he had met her, and he was grateful. Miriam stood also and called for her husband and introduced them with a brevity that required some context, which she gave carefully. Yusuf was someone she had known as a child. He had been kind enough to look them up when he was passing through Tabriz. He was an engineer from Tehran. Reza Kargar shook his hand with the open, easy handshake of a man who meets new people easily and does not complicate it. He said they should stay for dinner. Yusuf thanked him and said he had a drive to begin and that it was getting late. He said it had been a pleasure. He walked back through the narrow hallway and through the door and down the path between the low wall and the house. He did not look back immediately. He got to the end of the street and turned and walked to his car and drove out of the neighborhood and through the city and back onto the northbound road. He drove for an hour before stopping at the side of the road and sitting quietly in the parked car. He was not certain what he had expected from the meeting. He had not built it up into something it was not, or at least he had tried not to. But there was something he was working through. Something that needed the stillness of the parked car to settle into its right shape. What he was working through was this. She had not remembered. The thing he had carried for 26 years, the thing that had functioned as a standard and a measure and a form of orientation, was not a memory she had. For her it had been a moment, if she could even reconstruct it, of the most ordinary kindness, requiring no decision and no effort, over so quickly that it had left no trace. The bread was gone, the boy was gone, the morning was gone. She had gone to her next class and done her next thing and lived her life, and the moment had dissolved back into the ordinary texture of days the way moments do. And yet it had shaped him. It had been in the room at every important decision. It had been in the back of every calculation about what kind of person he was going to be. It had been the quiet standard against which he had measured every act of generosity he had either performed or received, and found most of them lacking and a very few of them matching. He sat with this for a while longer and then started the car. The thing he had arrived at, sitting at the side of the northbound road in the dark, was something he had always suspected but now knew, with the precision of a thing that has been verified. The power of what she had done had nothing to do with her. She had not intended it. She had not thought about it. She had simply done the right small thing and walked away. The power was entirely in the receiving. The person who needed it was the one who was changed by it, and the person who gave it had nothing to do with that part. This was not a diminishment. It was the opposite. It was the thing he had been trying to articulate to himself for 26 years, and had not had the right silence to hear clearly until now. Grace, the real kind, does not know it is grace. It is just a person tearing off a piece of their lunch and setting it down and walking through a gate. It is over in 10 seconds. It does not require the giver to understand what they are giving. It only requires them to see, clearly and without complication, that someone needs something and that they happen to have it. She had seen him at 12, lying on the ground in the courtyard, and she had done the only thing she had available to do. The bread. That was the whole of it. No performance, no audience, no record, just bread. He drove back to Tehran through the dark, and by the time he arrived and parked and climbed the stairs to his apartment, he had decided what he was going to do. He was not going to do nothing. That was not possible and was not something he would have been able to live with. But he was not going to do it in a way that put himself in the center of it, that made himself the character who arrives and announces and requires gratitude. He was not going to replicate the moment by standing at her door with the metaphorical equivalent of a bag of bread and saying, "Here, this is what I owe you." He was going to do what she had done. He was going to see a need. He was going to address it. He was going to walk away before anyone could thank him. He sat down at his desk and pulled out the piece of paper with her name on it, and added what he had learned. 3 children, a schoolteacher husband who taught mathematics and physics and who had the look of a man who was good at his work and was not paid well enough for it. A house that was kept with care and was not large. A family that was managing. Managing was not enough. Managing was the wrong level for the family of a woman who had fed him when he was lying on the ground. Managing needed to become something better than managing, and it needed to become that quietly, without anyone knowing why, without anyone tracing it back to a thin boy on a stone in 1957. He picked up a pen and began to think, with the focused precision of a man who has spent 30 years solving problems that the terrain and the budget and the circumstances have made complicated, about exactly how to do this. The first thing he arranged was a road contract. He had a project coming, a regional road improvement in the East Azerbaijan province, which was the province in which Tabriz sat. The contract was for engineering consultation and site management, and it required a local liaison who could manage communications between the project team and the regional municipality. It was the kind of role that required a person who was organized, reliable, and able to follow technical instructions with precision. It paid a reasonable amount, more than reasonable, enough to make a difference to a household that was managing. He knew someone who knew the head of the mathematics department at Reza Kargar's school, because Yusuf knew someone in almost every professional community that overlapped even tangentially with infrastructure, which was a wide net. He arranged, through 3 layers of connection that he kept entirely separate from each other, so that no single link in the chain could trace it back to him, for Reza Kargar's name to be put forward for the liaison role as a qualified candidate whose organizational record at the school had been noticed. He was not the only candidate. He was the strongest one, because Yusuf had made certain that the description of the role was written in terms that corresponded precisely to Reza Kargar's demonstrated skills. Reza Kargar got the role. He held it for 8 months across 2 years of the project. It paid the equivalent of 4 months of his teaching salary for part-time work that he could manage alongside his school schedule. Yusuf knew the project manager and knew the work had been done properly, because the project manager told him so without knowing why he was telling him. The second thing was the eldest son. The boy Yusuf had met at the door, the 12-year-old who had gone to fetch his mother with the unself-conscious ease of a child who has not yet learned to be formal with strangers, was named Omid. He found this out through Dariush, who had maintained his Tabriz network, and who was happy to mention things he knew, without knowing why he was being asked. Omid was, by 1985, a 14-year-old with, according to Dariush's contact at the school, a notable aptitude for science and mathematics that was recognized by his teachers, and that might, with the right support at the right time, lead somewhere significant. The right time was in 2 years, when he would sit the National University entrance examinations. The support that would make the difference was tutoring, specifically in advanced mathematics and physics, at a level that his school in Tabriz provided adequately but not exceptionally. The tutoring that would make the difference was available but was not free, and Yusuf had by now a reasonably precise understanding of the Kargar family's financial position, which was sufficient for essentials and insufficient for the kind of supplementary expenditure that changes trajectories. He established, in 1985, a small educational trust in the name of his mother, not a large foundation, not something public, a modest legal structure funded by a standing arrangement from a bank account that Helen Morandi managed with the same competent discretion she brought to everything. The trust was intended to support the university preparation of students in the Tabriz area who demonstrated particular ability in technical subjects, and who required financial assistance. The criteria were written carefully, and were in their specifics met by exactly one person, though they were written broadly enough that anyone looking at them would not know this. The trust contacted the school. The school identified Omid Kargar as a candidate who met the criteria. The trust arranged for his tutoring costs over 2 years to be covered, along with a small stipend for materials. Omid was told it was a scholarship program. He received a letter on official trust letterhead. The letter mentioned the trust's mission and its support for technically gifted students and nothing else. In 1987, Omid Kargar passed the university entrance examinations with a score that placed him in the top 4% of students in the country. He was admitted to the engineering faculty at the University of Tabriz on a state scholarship that his examination result had earned him without any additional assistance. He was not aware that his examination result would have been lower without 2 years of supplementary tutoring that he had received free of charge, because students receiving support they need do not typically think about the counterfactual. He simply knew that he had studied hard and done well, and both of those things were entirely true. Yusuf heard about this through Dariush, who had an ongoing and cheerful habit of mentioning things he knew about Tabriz that he thought might be of professional interest. He did not know this particular piece of information was of any other kind of interest. He simply said, in a letter about a bridge project he was working on, that the son of a school teacher he knew had done brilliantly on his university entrance exams and was going to study engineering, and was that not a fine thing? Yusuf wrote back and said it was, and put the letter in a drawer. The third thing took longer and required more care. He had understood, from his visit and from the information he had gathered around it, that the Kargar household was not under serious financial pressure, but was operating with the specific tightness of a family in which the adults work hard and are competent, and are held just below the level of ease by the consistent gap between income and what ease would require. This is a form of chronic low-level difficulty that is less dramatic than poverty, but more insidious in some ways because it is invisible and feels like a permanent condition rather than a solvable problem. He addressed this through the road contract first, which was a temporary improvement, then through Omid's education, which was an investment in the future of a different person. The third thing was aimed at the household itself, at the permanent structural condition of it. He had, by 1986, rebuilt his professional practice to a point where his influence in infrastructure procurement was again significant, not through political connections, which he had largely stepped away from, but through the kind of technical authority that becomes institutional over time. He was the person you called when the numbers did not add up and you needed someone who could tell you why, and that person's opinion carried weight. He used this weight, across 1987 and 1988, to direct a government housing improvement program into the eastern district of Tabriz where the Kargar house was located. The program was real and needed and addressed a genuine issue with the housing stock in several older residential areas of the city. He had not invented the program. He had, at a meeting at which several districts were being assessed for priority, provided a technical assessment of the Eastern District that placed it higher on the priority list than it had previously been ranked. His assessment was accurate. The need was real. He had simply given it the precise weight it deserved, which happened to benefit a street he had been to once. The improvements to the district included, among other things, a resurfacing of the road that ran past the Kargar house, and a program of structural assessments for the older properties. The Kargar house received an assessment and a set of recommendations and a subsidy towards the cost of addressing a drainage issue that was minor now but would have been expensive in 10 years. Reza Kargar organized the work with the efficiency of a man who is grateful for assistance and does not ask too many questions about why he is receiving it. None of these three things was visible as a connected set. Each existed within a different institutional framework. Each had its own legitimate justification. The road contract was part of a real project. The trust was a real trust that continued after Omid and supported 2 other students in subsequent years, because Yusuf had understood that making it single use would have made it legible in retrospect. The housing program was a real program that improved many houses and many streets. The connections existed only in Yusuf's mind and in his desk drawer, where he kept the piece of paper with Mariam's name on it and, below it, a list of what he had done, written in the coded shorthand of someone who wants a record for himself and not for anyone else. He did not go back to Tabriz, not yet. He stayed in contact through Dariush in the indirect, one-step removed way that had served him well, and from these contacts he received, over the years, an intermittent picture of how things were going, which was well, and then better. Omid graduated in 1991 with a degree in civil engineering, which was a form of symmetry that Yusuf noticed with a quiet private pleasure. He went on to a position at a firm in Tehran. He was, by all accounts, good at the work, with the specific practical intelligence that his examination scores had promised. Yusuf knew the director of the firm, not closely, but well enough to know that Omid Kargar had earned his place there on his own merits and that no assistance had been required or offered. A second child, a daughter, had finished secondary school. The third child was still young. Reza Kargar had been made head of department at his school. Miriam, from what Dariush could observe without knowing he was observing it, ran the household with the same forthright, competent attention she had brought to the doorway of her home and to the cup of tea across the sitting room table. The family was not wealthy. They were not managed anymore either. They were established. They had arrived at the level of stability where daily life is not a calculation and where the future has possibilities that are not blocked by the arithmetic of the present. This was enough. This was what Yusuf had been trying to engineer, and like all the things he had engineered, it was most itself when no one could see the work that had gone into it. He sat one evening in 1992 and read through the list in his desk drawer and then folded the piece of paper along its well-worn creases. He had done what he intended to do. He had done it the way she had done it, without ceremony, without an audience, without waiting to be thanked. He put the piece of paper back in the drawer. He was 52 years old. He had been carrying this since he was 12. He sat for a moment in the quiet of his apartment with the particular feeling of a man who has set something down that he has been carrying for a very long time. Not an absence, a rightness, the rightness of a load that has found its correct destination. His mother was still alive in Morand, in the house that had grown slightly better over the decades as he had sent money and arranged repairs and eventually bought her a newer stove that worked every time rather than sometimes. She was 71 and in reasonable health, and she washed her own clothes now, which she did not need to do, but which she did, because she had washed clothes for too many years for the habit to leave her. He visited her every few months. She was still a woman of few words and precise observation, and he was still, in the specific way that adult children remain children with their mothers, uncertain whether he fully knew her. He sat in the quiet apartment and thought of her hands and of bread and of a schoolyard in Morand that was long gone, because schools do not last forever, and nothing in that town had been the same since he was a boy. He thought of all of it and felt, for the first time in years, that the debts were balanced, and that he could move forward into whatever remained of his life without the specific weight of the unfinished thing. He was wrong about this, but in a good way. There was still one more thing to do, and it was the most important, and he would not understand this until he went back. He went back to Tabriz in the early summer of 2001. He was 61 years old, which felt different from the inside than it looked from the outside. From the outside, he was a compact, silver-haired man in a good coat who walked with the deliberate ease of someone who has spent decades on difficult terrain and has made a private peace with the effort of it. From the inside, he was still capable of being surprised by how quickly time moves when you are paying close attention to other things, and how a year that contains significant work and several solved problems can pass so quickly that it feels, in retrospect, like a week with a great deal of weather. His wife, a woman named Faride who had been a mathematics professor at the university, and who had married him in 1989, with the clear understanding that she was marrying a man who would always have one part of himself engaged with an engineering problem somewhere, had died of cancer in 1998. They had had 13 years that were marked, on both sides, by genuine affection and the specific warmth of two people who respect each other's intelligence and are not surprised by each other. He had grieved her in the way he did most things, quietly and completely, and without asking anyone to witness it. He had, after her death, continued to work, which was not a strategy for avoiding grief but simply the natural condition of being himself. The work had changed over the years. He was no longer on construction sites, not primarily. He consulted. He advised. He sat on the boards of 2 engineering institutions and contributed to policy discussions in the way that people with long careers contribute, by saying the thing that experience has made obvious and that youth has not yet had time to learn. He went to Tabriz because Omid Kargar had written to him. This had required some adjustment. He had read the letter twice and then set it on the desk and looked at it for a while. Omid's letter was addressed to him formally and correctly, the letter of a young professional to a senior one. It said that Omid had been told, by a colleague who knew someone at the ministry, that Yusuf had been an advisor on the East Azerbaijan infrastructure program in the late 80s. It said that Omid had grown up in the part of Tabriz that had benefited from that program, and that his family had received an assessment under the housing improvement scheme, and that he had always wanted, if the opportunity arose, to thank the people who had overseen work that had genuinely improved his family's situation. It said he understood this might be an unusual request, and he hoped it was not an imposition. There was no indication in the letter that Omid knew anything beyond what he had written. He did not know about the trust. He did not know about the road contract. He had connected Yusuf's name to the infrastructure program because that connection was, technically, real, and had followed it, with the professional curiosity of an engineer who had grown up in the affected area, to its source. He was thanking a senior engineer for a government program. That was all. Yusuf sat with this for a long time. He had not anticipated it. He had engineered invisibility, and the invisibility had held, but the program itself was a matter of record, and Omid Kargar was the kind of person who looked at records. He had, without knowing it, found the edge of the shadow that Yusuf had been working from. He wrote back. He thanked Omid for his kind words and said that the East Azerbaijan program had been a team effort, and that many people had contributed to it. He said that if Omid was ever in Tehran, he would be welcome to visit. He said this because it was genuine, and because he was curious, in the way that you are curious about a person you have watched from a distance for a long time without knowing them. Omid was not in Tehran but invited Yusuf to Tabriz, where he lived and where his parents still lived, and where he had, in the 6 years since graduating, built a small practice of his own in structural engineering. He said his mother had asked him to extend the invitation, and that she would be glad to offer proper hospitality to someone who had contributed, however indirectly, to his family's well-being. Maryam had asked him to extend the invitation. He drove to Tabriz on a Tuesday in June. The city was warm and the streets were busy, and he found the district without difficulty, because the streets were in his memory from the visit 18 years before, and streets, unlike people, change more slowly. Omid's office was near the center. He was a man of 30 now, solid and composed, with his mother's quality of direct attention in the eyes. He shook Yusuf's hand and showed him around the office, which was small and professionally arranged, and they talked for an hour about structural engineering, not about roads or history, just about the work, because that is the natural language of engineers when they are comfortable with each other. Then Omid drove him to the family house. It was different from the house he had visited in 1983. They had moved, some years earlier, to a larger place in the same district, a house with a proper garden and 3 bedrooms and a kitchen with a window that looked out over a small courtyard. The improvement was visible and solid, and Yusuf looked at it with the quiet satisfaction of someone seeing a completed project, which was not how anyone else in the room would have understood what he was looking at. Reza Kargar met him at the door. He was heavier than Yusuf remembered, white-haired now, with the settled ease of a man who has reached 60, and found that most of the things he was going to be have now been decided, and he is not displeased with the inventory. He retired from teaching the previous year, and was engaged in the happy business of reading things he had never had time to read. He shook Yusuf's hand warmly and said he was glad to finally meet the man behind the program. Maryam came from the kitchen. She was 58. She moved with a deliberateness that she had perhaps always had, and that Yusuf had not had enough time, in that first visit, to properly observe. She wore her hair covered in the way she had worn it since girlhood, and she looked at him as she had looked at him in 1983, with recognition, and now with the additional recognition of someone seeing a person for the second time after a long interval and making the adjustments required. She said she was glad he had come. She said it simply, without ceremony, in the way of someone who means what they say and does not feel the need to say more than they mean. She had prepared food, which she said with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who feeds people, as a natural expression of hospitality, rather than as a performance of it, and they were going to eat before the afternoon got too far along, and was that acceptable to him? He said it was. They sat at a table in the main room, the 4 of them, Maryam and Reza and Omid and Yusuf, and the second daughter, Shireen, appeared from somewhere, and was introduced and brought extra glasses and sat at the end of the table, with the pleasant composure of a young woman who is used to guests, and they ate. The food was simple and excellent in the way that food cooked by a confident cook for people she is glad to see is always excellent, and the conversation moved through several territories, engineering and teaching and the city and the state of the road north, which Yusuf assessed automatically and without being asked, and which made Omid laugh. The afternoon moved slowly and warmly, the way afternoons do when the room is right and the food is good, and no one is managing an impression or protecting a position. Reza talked about the books he was reading. Omid talked about a bridge project. Yusuf listened and contributed and felt, in a way that was unfamiliar enough to take a moment to recognize, at ease. At some point in the late afternoon, the others drifted. Omid took a call in the hallway. Reza went to check on something and came back with tea. Shirin cleared plates and did not return. And Yusuf found himself sitting with Maryam on one side of the table, and the fading afternoon light coming through the window above the courtyard. She looked at the window for a moment, and then at him. She said, "I have been thinking about what you told me when you came. About the schoolyard," she said. "I have thought about it more times than you would probably expect." He said he would not presume to know what she expected. She said she had gone back in her memory, many times, trying to find it. the fountain and the boy and the bread. She said she had a feeling of something, not quite a memory, more the shape a memory leaves when the detail has gone. She said she thought she could feel the weight of the bread and the choice to stop, but she could not actually see it. She said this bothered her, the way losing a word bothers you. The frustration of knowing something was there and not being able to access it. He said it did not need to be remembered by both of them. He said he had remembered it for both of them for 44 years, and that was sufficient. She looked at him with an expression that was complicated, and that he sat with, rather than trying to read too quickly. Then she said, "You said that what you remembered was that I walked away without waiting to be thanked." He said, "Yes," she said, "but you came and found me, twice." She said, "I think you have been waiting to thank me for a very long time." He was quiet for a moment. He said yes. He said she was right. He said he had told himself, for many years, that it was about the debt and the repayment and the principle of it, but that she was right, that underneath all of that there was something simpler, which was that he had wanted, eventually, to say thank you, and that he had not known how to do it without making it about himself. She said, "It was a piece of bread, Yusuf." He said, "I know. That was the whole point." She looked at him. He looked back. The afternoon light was very particular in the way of late summer afternoons, the specific gold that has no other comparison, and that does not last. Somewhere in the house, the sound of Reza making tea. She said, quietly, "I am glad you fainted in that courtyard." He looked at her. She said, "If you had not, I would not have given you the bread. If I had not given you the bread, you would not have come here. And I think," she paused, and said more quietly, "I think you are the only person who has ever told me that a thing I did without thinking was the most important thing I have done." He did not say anything. He did not have anything to say that would have added to this. He simply sat with it, the way he sat with good things, fully and without hurrying them toward their end. The tea came. Reza came back and Omid returned from the hallway, and the gathering reassembled itself around the table, and the conversation moved on to other things, the easy things of people who have eaten well and have the rest of the afternoon to use as they please. Yusuf stayed until the evening light had shifted all the way to a gray-rose color over the courtyard. Then he thanked the family for their hospitality and made his goodbyes, and Omid walked him to his car, and they shook hands again, with the warmth of two engineers who planned to work together and know it. He drove out of Tabriz and onto the southbound road and drove through the dark for a long time. He was not thinking, particularly. He was just driving, the way he had driven for decades on the roads of this country, many of which he had built or repaired or improved, roads that connected places that had been separate, that allowed movement where there had been stillness, that made possible the journeys that could not previously be made. He thought of his mother. He would visit on the way back. She was 81 now and still in Morand, still in the house, still with the good stove and the repaired roof, and the garden she had made for herself in the small courtyard. She would be awake. She was always awake late. He would sit with her and she would make tea, and they would not say much because they never said much, and it was always enough. He thought of the road ahead, the specific road he was on, its surface and its curves, and the particular way it descended from the mountains toward the plain. He had not built this road. He knew who had, though, because he knew the provenance of most of the major roads in this country, the way a reader knows the authors of the books on their shelves. He drove it the way you read a sentence written by someone you respect, with attention and a form of appreciation that is not quite admiration, but is not less than it. He thought, briefly, of Nasrin, who was a grandmother now, in a pleasant house in a suburb of Tehran, and who had built the kind of life she had wanted with the person she had wanted to build it with, and who had written him a kind letter when Faride died. He thought of Shirin, who was 72 and was, by the last account he had, still running the Paris business from a slightly reduced position, and with a fierceness that had apparently not diminished with the decades. He thought of Layla, who had married an architect in London, and who had, from what he heard, become a figure in the Iranian arts community in exile, doing for that community abroad what she had tried to do for it at home. All three of them, their lives going on in their different directions, remarkable in their different ways, and all of them carrying something forward that was worth carrying. He carried something forward too. He was 61 and it was summer, and the road south was clear and long, and the mountains to the east were dark shapes against a sky that was full of stars, in the way that skies are full of stars when you are far from city light, and the air is dry and clear, and the world reduces itself to its essential elements. He drove on. He died in March of 2009, in Tehran, in a hospital bed that faced a window with a view of a courtyard garden where a pomegranate tree was just beginning to bud. He did not see the garden. By the time the pomegranate tree was doing anything worth seeing, he was already somewhere else. But the people who had been in the room told this detail afterward, not because they thought he would have found it meaningful, but because the mind looks for coherence in endings, and a pomegranate tree is a detail that holds still long enough to be attached to something. He was 69. The cause was cardiac, which is to say the heart that had carried everything for 69 years had carried it long enough, and decided, on an unremarkable Tuesday in late winter, that the account was settled. He had not been unwell in any serious way until 6 weeks before, which is the most merciful version of the kind of ending that illness brings. He had known for 4 weeks, in the way you know when a structure has been assessed and the assessment is final, and he had used the 4 weeks the way he used everything, with focus and without waste. He had organized his professional affairs. He had spoken to his daughter, who was 32, and lived in Isfahan with her own family, and who came to Tehran and stayed, and did not leave again until it was over. He had a long conversation with Omid Kargar, who drove down from Tabriz and sat with him for a whole afternoon, and who did not cry in front of him, because Yusuf had asked him quietly not to, which Omid managed until he was in the stairwell of the hospital, where he stood for a long time against the wall before going back inside. He had written the note in the first week. He wrote it because he was a man who had always believed in setting things down in their correct form, in the small, careful handwriting that had been his since childhood, and that had not changed significantly in 57 years of use. He wrote it alone, at the desk in his apartment, in the early morning when the light was particular, and the city was not yet loud. He was not performing it. He was not imagining it being found. He was simply completing a record that had been running since 1957, and that needed, now, a final entry. He wrote, "A baker's daughter, 1957. She fed me and walked away." Everything else followed from that. He folded the note and put it in the back of his desk drawer, under the piece of paper with Mariam's name on it, where everything in this particular account was kept. His daughter, whose name was Nadia and who had her father's eyes and her mother Faride's habit of assembling thoughts before speaking, sorted through the papers in the apartment 3 weeks after the funeral. She was practical about this, which was the right way to be, and she was also, at intervals, not practical at all, which was also the right way to be. She found the note in the back of the drawer, folded and slightly worn at the creases in the way that paper gets worn when it has been folded and unfolded a number of times over a number of years. She read it standing at the desk. She read it twice. She did not know anyone named Mariam, and she did not know what had happened in 1957, though she knew from her mother that her father had grown up in Marand and had been poor and had won a scholarship, these being the biographical facts that Faride had known and had occasionally mentioned with the particular tone that spouses use when referencing the story that preceded them. She did not understand the note. She kept it, because you keep things from the drawers of the dead when you do not understand them, because there is a version of a future in which the understanding arrives, and because some things survive the person who wrote them, specifically because someone else, for reasons they cannot yet explain, did not throw them away. She put it with the other papers she was keeping, in a folder marked with his name and the year. What he left behind, which the obituaries mentioned, was a catalogue of roads and bridges and water systems that had been built, corrected, improved or salvaged by his intervention across a career of 40 years in Iranian infrastructure engineering. Several of the roads were named in specific provinces. Several of the bridges were given their technical designations. One item in one obituary noted that the East Azerbaijan infrastructure program of the late 80s, which had improved roads and housing stock in several areas of Tabriz, was widely regarded as a model for regional development, and that Yusuf had been a senior technical advisor on it. The item was 4 sentences long, which is a reasonable length for a technical contribution in a 3-paragraph obituary. Nasrin read the obituary online, in Tehran, where she still lived. She sat with it for a while. She thought about the man who had corrected her about agricultural productivity at a dinner party in 1972, and who had been right and had said so without drama, and had been more interesting to her for being right than he would have been for agreeing. She thought about the quality of his listening. She thought about the last time she had spoken to him, which had been 2 years earlier at a conference where they had briefly overlapped, and had stood in a corridor and talked for 20 minutes with the ease of 2 people who are comfortable with each other at a great distance, and do not require that distance to close. She had thought, walking away from that conversation, that she was glad to have known him. She thought it again now, reading the 4 sentences about the infrastructure program. Shirin did not read the obituary until 2 weeks after it appeared, because she was in Paris and her attention to Iranian news was selective and dependent on someone forwarding things to her. A former colleague sent it. She read it in her office, between 2 meetings, which was the only time she had, and she put it away and finished her day, and came home to her apartment and sat in the room where she kept the few things she had brought from Tehran that she had managed to carry, which were not many, and thought about a man who had been correct about soil expansion coefficients and who had refused to come to Paris. She thought that if he had come to Paris, he would not have been the person he was, and that the person he was the reason she had asked him. She had always found this particular form of paradox unhelpful, and had set it aside each time she came across it. She set it aside again. Layla heard in London from a member of the Iranian arts community who knew people, which is how news travels in the diaspora, which is to say reliably but not quickly. She heard it at a small gathering in someone's living room, and sat very still for a moment in a way that the person next to her noticed and mentioned later. She did not say much about it. She went home that evening and found a photograph she had from the late 70s, from one of her family's events, in which Yusuf appeared at the edge of the frame, turned slightly away from the camera in the way of a man who is more interested in the conversation in front of him than in being photographed. He was looking at something outside the frame. She kept the photograph in a book she read sometimes, and she put it back there and put the book back on the shelf and went to make tea. Omid Kargar did not give a speech at the funeral because he had not been asked, not being a member of the family, and because Yusuf had been the kind of man whose public life and private life were organized into compartments that did not communicate easily with each other. But he went to the funeral and stood at the back and was one of the last to leave the grave, and stood there for a long time in the cold March air. He did not know the full shape of what Yusuf had done. He knew about the infrastructure program. He had eventually, through the professional research of a curious engineer, come to understand that the program had been directed in part through deliberate technical assessment that had prioritized their district. He had understood this without knowing why. He had not made the connection to his mother, because why would he have? He had filed it under the category of a senior engineer who had done good work and whose influence had, perhaps, been extended in the right direction, which was how he had phrased the letter he had written in 2001, and which was accurate as far as it went. He stood at the grave in the March cold and felt the loss of a man he had met twice and corresponded with for 8 years, and who had felt, in some way he could not precisely name, like a form of continuity, like something that had been present in the background of his life for a very long time before he knew it was there. He would not understand this more precisely for another 3 years, which was when Nadia, going through more of her father's papers in a second, more considered sorting, found the full record in the desk drawer, the piece of paper with the entries and the note underneath, and the years of actions listed in the coded shorthand that took her a week to decipher, but that, once deciphered, was as clear and as complete as any engineering specification. She wrote to Omid Kargar because his name was in the papers, specifically and repeatedly, and because she had tracked his firm to Tabriz, and because she was the daughter of a man who finished things. He received her letter on a Thursday. He read it at his desk with the particular stillness of someone receiving information that is rearranging a significant portion of their understanding of their own history. He read it 3 times. He set it down. He called his mother. Mariam was 66, and she was, when her son called, in the kitchen of her house making dinner. She dried her hands on a cloth and sat down at the table and listened to her son read her the letter. She listened all the way through without saying anything. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. He asked if she was there. She said yes. She said she was there. She said, "I told you there was a boy. When you were a child, I told you there was a boy in the schoolyard." Omid did not remember this. She said she had told him the story once, when he was very small. She could not remember exactly when. About a morning when she was 12 and she had seen a boy who needed something and she had had the thing he needed, and so she had given it. She had told it as a small story about the right thing to do. Not as a story with a specific person in it, not as a story she expected him to remember. Omid was quiet. Then he said, "The trust, the scholarship." She said yes. He said, "The road contract." She said she hadn't known about the road contract, and he told her, and she sat at the kitchen table with the cloth still in her hands and the dinner cooling on the stove, and felt the full shape of it, the way you feel the full shape of something that has been present for a long time but in pieces, and you had not seen it whole until now. She did not cry. She was a woman who had learned, as a very young woman, to meet what life gave her with a clarity that was not coldness, but was close enough to it to be functional, and she brought this clarity to the kitchen table now. What she felt was not guilt. She had given a piece of bread to a boy who needed it. She had not manufactured a debt or solicited a return. What had grown from that moment had grown in him, from his own quality of mind and his own form of loyalty to a thing he had decided to remember. She had been the occasion. He had been the author. What she felt, after the clarity, was something that took her longer to name. It was the feeling of having mattered in a way you did not know you had mattered. Not to the world, Not in the way of monuments and programs and published work. In the specific and irreducible way of having been present at the moment that another person needed you to be present and having, without choosing it exactly, been the right person to be there. She thought of him, not the silver-haired man at the table who had asked about the painting in the road. The boy she must have seen once, and which some part of her had registered clearly enough to act, and which had then dissolved back into the morning the way all those mornings dissolved. She had been 12, she had had bread, he had been on the ground. She had given what she had. She had walked away. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the dinner cooling, the cloth in her hands, the evening coming in through the window over the courtyard, the specific evening light of Tabriz in autumn, low and golden and brief. Then she got up and went back to the stove, and she finished making dinner, because people were coming home and they needed to eat, and some debts can only be repaid in the currency of the person who received them, and there was nothing more for her to do. There was, in fact, nothing more for anyone to do. The account was settled, the road was built, the boy had become a man who built roads, the man had become someone who knew, with the precision of a person who has measured the thing carefully over a long period of time, that the distance between a piece of bread and the life he had made was not a paradox or a myth or a lesson. It was simply what had happened, what one person gave when they had it, and another person used when he needed it, and neither of them was wrong about any of it, and the world between them was the proof. The pomegranate tree in the hospital courtyard bloomed that spring. It bloomed without comment and without anyone paying it particular attention, which is the correct way for things to bloom. The note in the desk drawer stayed where it was, in Nadia's folder, in Nadia's house, where it remained because she could not bring herself to move it and did not need to. Some things do not need to go anywhere. They are already where they need to be.